For 6 months, I've researched game design, watching videos, reading articles, listening to podcasts, reading books, interviewing successful designers, and designing my own games. In this video, I'm going to share with you my 5 major takeaways because there is a lot of consensus amongst all of these different resources that I did not expect. Hi, I'm Scott, and normally I talk about painting miniatures on this channel, but today I'm going to deviate a little bit. The hobby of miniature wargaming is really many different hobbies in one, and the creative aspect is a huge part, but also the gameplay is another huge one, and as a hobbyist myself, I find both of them super interesting. As of November 2024, I played over 180 games that I've logged on BoardGameGeek that range from miniature war games to board games to card games and more. Only recently have I started to dabble with writing my own rules, but to start off on the right foot, I did some research up front and discovered some major lessons that really resonated with me. Lesson number 1, fun. I read a book called The Theory of Fun, which is just that. A book that explores what fun is and what role games play in society. Spoilers, games are meant for you and your players to have fun. That's it.
Look, when we talk about why we make games and what we want the audience to get out of the game, it's an emotional response. You know, we talk about fun, and maybe you're trying to create other emotions. There's games that do things other than produce fun, but you want to get some emotional response out of your audience.
There is a contractual agreement with players and a rule set that states that if you sit down with your friends and learn this game, you will have a good time. It's the same agreement with all formats of entertainment, an exchange of time and effort, and an expectation of enjoyment. But there are so many ways a game can be a lot of fun or not a lot of fun, and I want to talk about some of the biggest examples that spoke to me the strongest. Raph Koster defines fun as coming from challenges that are always at the margins of our ability, which I find so incredibly true. Think of the extremes. If you're playing a tournament-winning Warhammer 40K player, you're probably going to have a bad time because that far exceeds your capability as a player. The challenge is too high and unreachable and thus not fun. This doesn't just happen in competitive games either. It can happen in co-op games when you don't understand the objective or the levers the game wants you to pull and you feel directionless. At the same time, if you solve a game and the most optimal path forward is obvious, that's also not very fun. Heck, even if you haven't solved the game, if it feels trivial or simple, that's also a turnoff, like tic-tac-toe. I've never cared to solve that game for myself just because it seems so trivial to begin with. You want to empower your players to make them feel as though they understand and can accomplish the goal you're offering. D. Brad Talton Jr. says that excitement exists in the space between discovery and mastery. It's important for your players to feel like they're stretching their strategic limbs to accomplish an achievable goal. But how they go about doing that is also vitally important. In board game design advice, Keith Bergen is quoted as saying, "Never make players choose between fun and effective."
We want players to make meaningful choices and not put in gotchas and traps that say like, well, yeah, you can kind of put these stats wherever you want, but not really. Like,
I think about how many war gear options in my Age of Sigmar faction are just not good. Sadly, many of those options that would be consistent with the theme that I have going on are just bad. And I feel bad taking them knowing there are clearly better options. Again, it doesn't really feel like I have a choice.
if something is required for viable play, why is it an option?
I want to inspire gamers to be creative within the system that I'm defining, to poke and prod at it and find things that I didn't know existed. That kind of thing will never happen if the perceived value of the options is very different. Analyzing the various stats and capabilities of your choices is absolutely a fun part of miniature wargames, however. In The Theory of Fun, Raph states that anticipating a solution can be as exciting as applying one.
Buying a book is a fun hobby. Reading the book is a different part of that fun hobby. Imagining what kind of army you'll build is a fun hobby. Collecting the parts is a fun part of the hobby. And if that's as far as you go, that's still, you've done a bunch of cool hobby stuff.
This is an experience I'm sure we're all familiar with. You have to make a deck of cards for a card game or write a list for a war game. While writing the list, you imagine how various mechanics will interact to support themselves, how certain units will act as counters to a strategy that would be really strong against your army, and so on. Anticipating those situations and then seeing them play out on a table is a huge area of enjoyment for players and myself as well. For my game that involves 2 duelists, there isn't a huge opportunity for traditional list writing, but what if you zoomed in? What if the list writing was what specific weapon you're taking, what armor set, what talismans, banners, etc.? You can go to a game store with 3 different duelists trying to accomplish different things and try them out against your opponent to see if they play like how you imagined. Maybe they're better against a certain character like a wizard, but struggle against something like a barbarian. That kind of discovery in gaming, research, and development is so exciting for me personally, so I want to make sure that it exists in my game. Lesson number 2, ego. To be a game designer, and honestly a creative person who is comfortable putting anything out into the world for people to judge, you need to have a bit of an ego.
So I'm gonna let you in on a secret. People who create tend to have large egos because it takes ego to will something into existence.
Personally, I have a very large ego that my wife keeps in check on a regular basis, but an ego can often get in the way a bit. Jerry Hawthorne, developer of Heroescape, has learned that ego is not who you are and can inspire to undermine what impact you want to have on the world. What does that undermining look like in practice, though? You might overvalue your ideas, being unwilling to share and collaborate with other designers, which is definitely something that I struggle with. In an article by Jamie Stegmaier, creator of Stonemaier Games and some of my favorite board games, he shares a list of very compelling reasons that support why designers should share their ideas. The one that resonated the most with me was that when your project is out there in the wild, it's actually more safe than hidden away in your brain. Not only does sharing your ideas allow for other people to offer feedback, potentially improving your game, but also there's a historical breadcrumb trail that leads back to you. Whether or not that breadcrumb trail leads to an idea that isn't actually unique or is any good is up for debate. Ego can also lead to designers creating rules and mechanics just for the sake of it.
I want those mechanics to not be a barrier for you. I don't need to be clever for my own feelings of being original.
This was absolutely the path that I was going down when I first started to write down some rules. I criticize GW's games a lot for being the same 15 mechanics mixed up with a different coat of paint on them, and I wanted to kind of fight against that. I wanted to reinvent the wheel, but as Mark Rosewater, the developer of Magic: The Gathering for the past couple of decades, reminds us,
But you can't let your ego drive your motivation. Remember, your goal is to deliver an optimal experience for your target audience. Your decisions have to serve your game and not you. So ask yourself, is this decision helping me achieve the optimal experience for my target audience? Or is it being done to fulfill an inwardly facing need for self-satisfaction? Because if the answer is the latter, you're doing it for the wrong reason.
So what is a good barometer for what ends up in your game? Lesson number 3, mechanics and theme. All right, so you have an idea or a feeling for a game, but now you need to translate it to actual rules and mechanics, and that can be super challenging. The sport of volleyball can be played with you and your friends on a beach, but also by professional athletes in an indoor court with 4-line judges observing. Both scenarios are the exact same game with the same rules, but they feel extraordinarily different. And if someone were to create a volleyball miniature war game, hint, hint, you would need to decide what feeling you're going for.
The game has to be about something. It has to be mechanically about something. That alchemy that I've talked about before, where you take some mechanics and through their interlockingness and through being processed by the human computer that's the player, like that interpretation creates a feeling in people's mind, and that feeling absolutely has to be that I'm being chased by zombies, or that, you know, there's a Regency era duel going on, and that nothing else could be true of that alchemy, because that's what that alchemy is trying to create.
I 100% agree with what Mike is encouraging here. Start with a theme or a feeling, and then design the game around that. In The Theory of Fun, the author states that no system should be in the game that does not contribute toward that lesson. The lesson being what the game is trying to teach you or what it's trying to get you to feel.
When I made Company of Iron, the goal was skirmish war machine. So for the first couple of weeks, I was just noodling around with rules and writing documents and thinking about the game. And then we had a meeting where I'm thinking about not putting Warjacks in. And they were like, well, you have to put Warjacks in. It's War Machine.
Jeff Engelstein, author of Game Tech, says something similar. By fitting the theme and mechanics together appropriately, you can dramatically reduce the complexity in a game. This was a huge light bulb moment for me. Not only does the theme help to evoke a feeling like being a pirate or being chased by zombies, but it also helps players learn your game faster.
For example, in Magic, we have a mechanic called flying. It is the easiest mechanic to teach, because all I have to say is, it flies. Even though in a vacuum there's rules with it, but it so matches expectation, it so matches what people already know that it's easy to learn.
I'm trying to make a dueling game where each player controls a single figure, and if by the end of playing the game it doesn't feel like a back and forth murderous dance, well, then I've failed. If I have an ability called Mighty Strike with a two-handed axe as an image and it doesn't translate to big damage and a slow, cumbersome swing, well, then I've also failed. Something else to consider when you're thinking about what mechanics to add to your game is what Jeff Engelstein calls the innovation limit. We as gamers love fresh new ideas, but in reality, we can only tolerate so much. We want what we're playing to feel like the sort of game that we would enjoy, while also engaging us strategically with new ideas and concepts to explore. There is, however, a tipping point where you've innovated too much and the game you're making no longer feels like other games from the genre of players you're trying to attract. People who play miniature war games are very familiar with how Games Workshop games work as far as combat goes. You often roll to hit, roll to wound, your opponent has a save roll, and if enough damage is done, your models run away in fear. The exact same steps are followed by many games designed by completely different companies, like A Song of Ice and Fire. Roll to hit, roll to save, and then run away. But some games follow that scheme while also innovating. In fact, a lot of game designs start out by just simply stealing.
And so that's where I think the starting point for anybody, especially if you've never even dabbled before, is just start thinking about what you like and what you don't like, and then beg, borrow, and steal. Like if there's 5 games you love, just start with all the mechanics that they have in them and start playing, and then you'll eventually start making creative choices about places you want to go where those games don't.
In Guild Ball, you roll to hit, but with your successes, you aren't only doing damage. You can spend your successes like a currency to do damage, of course, but you can also move your model around, move your opponent's model around, knock your opponent over, etc. That's the kind of innovation that still feels like a miniature war game, but is uniquely different and worthwhile. Before we get on to the next lesson, let me tell you about our Black Friday deals. 'Tis the season for holiday shopping, and every year I have sales on my web store, but this year we're doing something a little bit different. Buy 2 of any of my models and get a third of a similar type for free. That means buy 2 75mm models and get a third in that same scale. Buy 2 32mm models and get a third in that same scale. Buy STLs, etc., etc. The same is true for the masterclass courses. Buy any 2 and get the third for free. Finally, you can buy a cutting mat and get the brush box for half off. These deals will be valid between now and the following Cyber Monday, so a full week. I hope you guys enjoy the holidays and find time to connect with your family and find some time for rest as well. All right, back to the video. Lesson number 4, direction. When I was first researching all of this stuff, I was beginning to get a little stressed out because I felt like I was being pulled in a lot of different directions. I have an idea for a game, but I don't want to miss the mark. I don't want to over-design and make it feel clunky and alien. And I just felt like there were a lot of rules pushing and pulling me in a lot of different directions, and I felt like I had no heading. But then I heard this.
So lesson number 11, if everyone likes your game but no one loves it, it will fail. And I can't stress this enough. People too often want to minimize the negative. They're so worried about not having anybody dislike something that they miss the big picture, which is that's not the important part. You have to make sure you evoke the positive response. People have to fall in love. There's a lot of attention out there. There's a lot of games to play. If your game doesn't make someone fall in love with it, guess what? They're going to go to a game that does.
You can't take the top 5 miniature war games and synthesize their rules into a mechanical average and crank out a game in hopes that you're gonna please everybody. You need to inspire people's passion, which means people will both love and hate it. This was a breath of fresh air to me, and it gave me the creative license to drive this game design ship in the direction that ultimately I wanted, to make bold choices, knowing full well that some players aren't going to like them, but others will hopefully love them. In a book called The Board Game Design Advice, author Gabe Barrett interviews many designers. James Ernest says that art is a conversation between the artist and the user. Pandering to any intermediary diminishes the value of the work.
So people have really strong feelings about this stuff, but we knew that there was a big group within our core audience that we could probably make something for them where most of those people would be happy.
There's you and the group of people that you're trying to capture the imagination and passion of. Don't let a general audience or a set of best practices or a marketing strategy get in between you and your target audience.
You need to make sure that the game expresses the ideas that you had as clearly as possible in its final form, and then just let it ride and see what happens.
Lesson number 5, rapid fire. Admittedly, this session is not one key lesson, but a bunch of extra stuff that I couldn't cleverly fit into a succinct category, but I still really want to share it with you all. Jeff talks about emergent strategies in game tech, which is a way of playing the game that doesn't become apparent until you actually have figures on the table. I like this idea so much that I wrote in my notes, I love this idea and I want these in my game. Only a beginner writes something like that. I'm talking about emergent strategies like they're freaking Pokemon. Anyways, an example would be a mechanic that no one thought was going to be impactful until you saw it played out on the table. In the very early versions of Age of Sigmar, the pile-in rule is an example of an emergent strategy. At first, it seemed like a pretty basic idea, but when you actually started to play the game, where you placed your models before you piled in, how you piled in, and more were really important questions to ask. And a basic mechanic like piling in became an opportunity to express skill in the game. Jeff also talks about something called intransitive properties, which is basically the whole point of rock, paper, scissors. You can have a rule in your game that's very strong and useful, but there can also be something else that counters that rule. Having intransitive properties in your rules allows space for exciting, almost game-breaking ideas to exist because they can be kept in check. It's something that makes list writing so fun, as aforementioned. Last time I made a game design video, I asked you guys for games that I should play to get inspired, and quite a few of you said I should try out Flesh and Blood, and that turned out to be an amazing recommendation. Not only do I really enjoy the game, but I also learned a ton from playing it. Fab has a big design space, but not every character leverages every part of it. Some characters can deal and absorb arcane damage, some characters banish cards, some use the arsenal a lot, and I could go on forever. Let's say each character touches like half of the available design space, and the combination of elements they leverage make up a unique character. It's very important for characters and armies in a game to feel unique so the players feel like they have ownership over the thing they're choosing. And part of that comes from feeling like you're unique when compared to your opponents.
Allow your players to have a sense of ownership. This is very important, that if you want your players to bond as closely as you can, the game has to move beyond being yours and become theirs. You have to find a way to make sure that the player can do that. And the key is customization, because you want your player to be able to do something that nobody else could do, that they did, that's their creation.
While interviewing Sean Sutter, designer of Relic Blade, he talked about how he initially released the game.
You know, Relic Blade started as like minimum viable product, like just the minimum number of characters. When the game launched, it was a fantasy game without any wizards, you know? It's a fantasy game without elves, you know? So like coming in, I felt like there was stuff I really wanted to add, but I also held back and was like, I'm not sure exactly how it'll go into the game design and game mechanics, so I want to do it right.
This was a huge wake-up call for me. I'm the kind of person who really likes to get all of their ducks in a row. Can you tell by the nature of this video? I've done a deep dive on how to make a game and have no full game to show for it. Whoops! This is an important lesson for a lot of artists, that perfection is the enemy of done, that your ideas are nothing without execution. The list goes on and on. I find myself thinking about how to produce liquid plastic injection models at scale before I have a gameplay loop figured out. Defining a list of necessary steps to reach a functioning minimum viable product, and then iterating on that is important. And at some point, you need to just cut a release and just see what happens. Those are all my learned lessons about game design from all of the wonderful resources. I feel so fortunate to have all of these people that are so big in the game design universe, just showering newbies like me with really great information. It just feels like learning about all of this stuff has been so easy and straightforward. And it's been an absolute blast. And I can't wait to keep developing more of my games as well. Which, speaking of, I know this has been a very long time since I kind of rebooted this series. I just don't think people on the channel are super interested in game design in general, and so the videos tend to not do as well. But every once in a while, I would love to make a video about game design and about games in general, just because I personally love that, and I do want this channel to be kind of a hybrid between many elements of the hobby, not just the creative aspect. So yeah, hopefully it wasn't too much of an issue and you enjoyed it. Hopefully some of these recommendations can help you and inspire you in your journey to design a game. If you guys like the channel and you want to support it, there are a lot of ways to do that. Picking up some of these books with their affiliate links down in the description is a huge way. Buying some of my stuff, my web store, awesome discounts for Black Friday that I mentioned earlier in the video is another huge way as well. Subscribe or die! And most importantly, don't forget to